right, well, welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to have you here for a very important event that will bring us not full circle, but half circle to where we hope to be. The circle began in one way for the Hoover Institution in October of 2019, when Jimmy Lai was the keynote speaker at an event that we had here at the Hoover Institution, when he was very memorably and movingly interviewed by our own Peter Robinson, when the specter of him facing potential indefinite imprisonment by the Chinese Communist Party state in what passed for a pseudo-government in Hong Kong was already upon him. And he nevertheless returned knowing full well what his fate might be. The circle will now be half complete to hear this remarkable individual who came to know and work with Jimmy, who I will in a moment introduce, Mark Clifford, present this extremely illuminating and moving biography of Jimmy Lai. And the circle will be complete, Mark, as we were talking earlier, when we pray and have to believe Jimmy is released and will be able to make a return visit to the Hoover Institution. So the title of our event today is From Press to Protest to Prison, and then we hope to liberation. Jimmy Lai and the End of Hong Kong Freedom. The author of this great book, and which I urge you to read, in fairness to Mark, to buy in some form, The Troublemaker, How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic. I won't steal Mark's thunder, but The Troublemaker is revealed in the epigraph quote from the late John Lewis about good trouble. And now to introduce Mark. He is the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, an NGO dedicated to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law for the people of Hong Kong. Previously, he was executive director of the Hong Kong-based Asia Business Council and a board director at Next Digital, which is, of course, the Hong Kong media giant founded and majority owned by Jimmy Lai. During his 28 years in Hong Kong, and it must have been very painful for you to have to bring those to an end, since it was such a remarkable place, Mark Clifford served as editor-in-chief of both English language newspapers, the South China Morning Post, which I will say again was one of my favorite newspapers, and The Standard, the latter of which he was also publisher. He held senior editorial positions at Business Week and the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he lived in Asia from 1987 until 2020. History graduate at the University of California, Berkeley, Glenn, and a Walter Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University, holds a PhD in Hong Kong history from the University of Hong Kong. He is also the author of Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, what China's crackdown reveals about its plans, which I'm sure it thinks are well along, to end freedom everywhere. Mark, it's really an honor to have you here. It's very meaningful for us to have this new event about Jimmy Lai, and we turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. Expected applause at the beginning. We'll see if I still deserve it at the end. But no, thanks so much, and to Francis and your other colleagues here. I really do hope and pray that Jimmy can come back here. I think that Hoover has a very special place for Jimmy and his wife, Teresa, who were very close friends to Milton and Rose Friedman and spent a lot of time in the Friedman's final years up here in Palo Alto in the Bay Area with the Friedman. So, and of course, he made that, that remarkable speech event back in October 2019. So it's been a long 6 years since then. Since December 2020, Jimmy has been in prison, most of that time in solitary confinement. So think of that, we're at around 1,800 days in a place that's smaller than this table here. But so anyway, thank you for the very, very kind introduction. I have some slides that I'll go through really fast. I hope it's not too fast, but what I'd like to do is give everybody a sense of Hong Kong and of Jimmy's story. I mean, Jimmy's story really is the story of Hong Kong, from rags to riches to really prison and the end of freedom. But he's a man. He's not just a symbol. He's not just an abstract political prisoner. He's just a living, breathing, remarkable person. This is Jimmy with his twin sister and mother and an older sister, a couple years older. The family, he was born in the late 1940s, a couple years before Mao took power. We're not really sure if he was born about 1947. The father left for Hong Kong after Mao took power, leaving the mother with these three kids. And the mom was in and out of what Jimmy always called labor camps. They weren't technically labor camps, as I think China specialists would call them, because she was able to come home on weekends. But these kids were 4 years old, 6 years old, scraping by, trying to survive. That's Jimmy at the age of 11 or 12, shortly before he went to Hong Kong. He snuck into Hong Kong aboard a smuggling vessel, bringing illegal immigrants into Hong Kong. At the time he arrived, 1961, China was going through a famine that killed, we don't know, let's say 45 million people. I mean, at this point, it's beyond really imagination. Just one of the greatest, worst man-made famines in human history. It took me a long time to figure out why his mother gave him permission to go first to Macau and then to Hong Kong. Then I realized she was afraid her son was going to starve to death. You just think about what kind of choice a mother has to make. And the twin sister, 4 years later, also made it. She swam to Hong Kong with a friend who almost drowned in the process. So this was the China that Jimmy left, one that had ripped apart his family, put his mother in a camp. Some stories have her kneeling on broken glass, having a dunce's cap on her head, being regarded as a class enemy because her former husband who'd run away, had been wealthy. She was a peasant, but that was Maoist China. This is the Hong Kong that Jimmy came to. People sleeping on the streets, a place that was, I mean, beyond dirt poor. This is a typical informal settlement, shanty town. Jimmy's aunt, his mother's sister, and uncle lived in one of these. Place was so small that there wasn't even room for Jimmy to sleep on the floor. So his aunt found him a place in a glove factory where he could at least sleep in the factory, spent the first night there, started as a factory hand the next day. Starts as a factory hand, 15 years later, he owns a factory. I mean, this was the Hong Kong of the 60s and 70s. So you think Jimmy is coming to this city of 3 million people, 1.5 million of them are desperate refugees from Maoist China. And lots of them didn't make it, but Jimmy was one of the ones who did. He lost hearing in 1 year. He lost a fingertip. I mean, it wasn't nice working in this factory. But this is Jimmy in the late 1980s. In his Giordano retail store, he went from owning a factory and becoming the largest sweater manufacturer in Hong Kong. Started all sorts of business productivity improvements. I mean, really was a great businessman, and that's one of the things that I learned from this book. He wasn't just your run-of-the-mill, one of 10,000 or whatever, these fantastic people that you knew so many of them in Hong Kong, Alvin. He really was one of the best of the best. Started business after business. So this is, of course, 1989, the Tiananmen Square democracy protesters, and Jimmy was so moved by the democracy protesters that for the first time since he'd left China, he really became engaged politically with what was going on in China. So think of this guy, and he's born in the late 40s, escapes to Hong Kong in 1961, spends the 1960s, 70s building up his business or working in a factory, owning a factory, selling to companies like The Limited, coming to New York, coming to the States, going to Tokyo, sets up Giordano, and then Tiananmen comes along. And so he's been fascinated by Deng Xiaoping and the prospect that economic reform was going to make China rich, this country that had been so ripped apart his family, but that it was going to lead inevitably to political and social reform. So he started making T-shirts and selling them in those Giordano stores. And these three people, Chai Ling, Wu Kai-shi, and Wang Dan, were subjects of his T-shirts, were student leaders. And he sent over $100,000 in cash up to the Tiananmen students, set up tents. And then, of course, this happened, the killings. And as I've shown this picture, sometimes I started thinking Jimmy's kind of like the tank man today, I think. But so then he decides he's going to go into media. He says, enough of the clothing. What the Communist Party is obviously going to be transformed. And funny, we think about it historically. Tiananmen was just a couple of months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Jimmy had already decided to go into media, but you just think of the ferment of that time. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses a few years later. Jimmy thinks media, transparency of information, openness, that's going to shine a light on the Chinese Communist Party, on its corruption, its inefficiencies, its cruelty, and that will eventually be the downfall of the CCP. So he sets up first Next Magazine, and then he sets up Apple Daily. And you can see he's bringing his retail, his marketing expertise. Who named the newspaper Apple back in 1995? And he invested in that's Chris Patton, the last governor. He is the first guy in Hong Kong to invest in color presses. He got some of the best presses in the world. And again, this is something to remember about him. He's a businessman that invested in his staff, his people, equipment, training, service, and of course, graphic design and looks. And so, he was just such a breath of fresh air. He was so different from the other Hong Kong press proprietors. Then, of course, 1997 and the handover. So he started Apple Daily 2 years before the handover. He knew what he was doing. To your point earlier, Larry, I mean, Jimmy has always known what he's up against. I saw him on a stage in June 1995 with Al Newharth, who was the founder of USA Today, longtime head of Gannett. Jimmy started crying because he said, "I know I'm going to jail." And we're sitting there thinking, really? Well, he was just early, but he knew what risks he was running. I mean, again, from his earliest age, he'd seen what communist China could do. Well, guess what? The political parties were weak deliberately, and Next Magazine and Apple Daily became kind of the focus of opposition. So this is a photoshopped face of Tung Chee-hwa, the first chief executive of Hong Kong, who tried to push through some national security legislation in 2003. Something like 500,000 people came out in the streets, incredibly peaceful. It was Jimmy, it was Next Magazine, it was Apple Daily that got those people out. I mean, it was other political people, it was a whole civil society thing, but I just can't overstate the importance that Apple and Jimmy and Next, and we had 1,000 people on his staff in Hong Kong, so it wasn't just Jimmy. His journey continued. Jimmy, it's interesting, he's not a Nelson Mandela type or Lech Walesa. He doesn't want political power. He was happier, being at home or on his boat than out on the streets. But in 2014, during the Umbrella movement, he decided he should come out and be with his students. And that was, I think, the first day at the beginning of Umbrella. And it got tear gassed, obviously. This is what the Umbrella movement looked like. 79 days. Jimmy was out there with his tent, in front of his tent, every day. People could come and talk to him. Some pro-Beijing thugs dumped pig guts on him. I mean, he was there out on the lines, and at the end offered himself up for arrest. That was December 2014. I think the first time he was arrested. This is, as I said, I want people to see Jimmy as a person. This is Jimmy with his wife Teresa in New Orleans in May 2017. Fast forward to 2019, the Umbrella movement ended in 2014. The students wrote in big letters, "We will be back," and they came back in even greater numbers in 2019. We had as many as 2 million people out on the streets. It's just an incredible outpouring of citizen power. And you think of 2 million people in a city of 7.5 million, it's kind of like 90 million Americans proportionally going out in the streets of Washington. Government refused to even pretend to engage in negotiations. These are just a couple pictures from 2019, because there's this myth that Jimmy is this black hand, that he somehow organized everything, and that he's, spearheading this campaign to topple the CCP. It wasn't Jimmy, it was the people of Hong Kong. And I think anybody who thinks that this is some kind of sinister plot by Jimmy or the CIA or foreign forces is just deluding themselves. These are so-called Lenin walls, where people would write on Post-it stickets. There were, dozens, scores of these all over the city. This is Jimmy. He went to jail for this March in August 18th, 2019. This is like a pop-up spontaneous demonstration just at lunchtime, one time during that summer of 2019 in one of the Hong Kong shopping malls. This is August 2020, just after the national security law came in and Jimmy was arrested for the first time. As Larry said, I was on the board of directors of Next. It was a bit disconcerting to have 250 police walk into your newsroom as they did that morning, start hauling things off. Perp walked Jimmy through the newsroom. The amazing thing is the staff kept live streaming. They were interviewing him. I mean, I've really got to give a lot of credit to the staff, and I want to also acknowledge and remember that besides Jimmy, there are 6 other staff who are in jail. They've all pled guilty. They're being held hostage to Jimmy's trial. Jimmy getting out a couple days later. Then in December 2020, he was put back in for good. This is one of the last pictures we have of him. The authorities froze our bank accounts without a court order or anything other than an assertion that we might have broken the law. That put us out of business. This is the last issue that was printed. This is the last picture we've seen of Jimmy. It was from 2023, a little more than 2 years ago. You know, taken surreptitiously, for which the photographer was thrown out of Hong Kong. I don't know why they're so afraid of Jimmy, but they are. This is just a couple things that the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation does. We work for all political prisoners in Hong Kong, but we do a lot of media work. We do a lot of legislative work. We do a lot of research, but we also just like to get attention. So this is the Guggenheim Museum in New York, a couple shots from that. That was Tower Bridge in London just before the 2022 Olympics in Beijing. And just some final shots. That's Teresa, that's the daughter Claire and son Augustine. That's a shot with Jimmy with a picture in the back painted by Wallace Ting, a great Chinese American painter who was friends with Jimmy, who Jimmy studied with. Jimmy spent a lot of his time in prison drawing, and is actually really quite a decent artist. So that's it. And I just thought I just want to warm people up and give you a sense of who we're talking about.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great overview of his life and his evolution, and the photographs, including apparently some of those photographs were taken by you, I gather.
I mean, but friends.
Very powerful and evocative portraits of the extraordinary democratic energy. I'll ask you a few questions, if I may, and then we'll just open it up to our community here. Your book tells a remarkable story about a man and a society and a set of aspirations. And in part, it's a story, a continuing story of his evolution. But I'd like to ask you about 2 big pieces of it. One was the intellectual evolution from, just a businessman, really, wanting to make money in an immensely energetic and creative entrepreneurial fashion to a fiercely principled and widely read, deeply read devotee of economic freedom principles, Hayek, von Mises, Friedman, and so on. And that journey to a kind of intellectual economic libertarianism wouldn't necessarily and absolutely predict the second transition to political kind of democracy activists. So could you speak about each of those transitions in his life and what you think brought them about?
Yeah, well, I'll try. I mean, great questions, Larry. So Jimmy never even finished primary school. You think of this. He had the twin sister, had the photographic memory, just breezed through school. Jimmy was just a truant, a troublemaker, in like kind of, a junior.
Before he became this kind of troublemaker.
Exactly. I was going to say like a junior hooligan troublemaker, right? I mean, he's picking up cigarette butts and re-rolling them and selling them. He's stealing metal and selling it for scrap. And one time the police knocked on his door and he opened. I didn't do it, he said. I mean, he knew the cops pretty well. And then he makes it to Hong Kong, and he's a very engaging guy. He's very charismatic. He's really hard work, and he's off the charts smart. And But he's also kind of a loudmouth. And sometime in the late 1970s, on one of his trips to New York, he had dinner with, he kind of had a family that had adopted him. Throughout his life, he's had people that have really, older people who've really kind of nurtured and helped him. He's pretty rough. And they took him to a dinner, and he was complaining about the Chinese Communist Party. At the end of the dinner, his host said, kind of like, instead of just shooting your mouth off, why don't you read something and learn something about the structure behind this? And he reached up to the bookshelf and pulled out Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which is, of course, not about the Chinese Communist Party, but it's about state control. And from there, he was off to the races. I mean, I think like many self-made people who didn't have a formal education, not like many, but there's a certain subset of people who didn't have a formal education or much of a formal education, just hungry. I mean, Jimmy was always reading. And so he started reading Hayek, von Mises, obviously Friedman later on. He met Friedman around 1990, 92. They traveled to China together. And so and look, he's in Hong Kong, which is, Alvin knows very well. I mean, that was like, kind of ground zero of a kind of free market oriented place, especially in that kind of 1960 to 1990 period. Very, low tax, few regulations, kind of anything goes. And so he came out of that environment economically. The harder one is like, when did he switch? Like, what trigger made political freedom so important for him? So if you think of it in kind of like Maslow hierarchy of needs, at first his freedom is just food. And he said that. I mean, he wakes up the first morning in Hong Kong in 61, and he smells rice from congee and the dough buns and things. He's like, I've gone to heaven. And it's also the freedom to work and make your own money and, be able to have some of the good things in life. I mean, he had a chauffeured Rolls Royce. He had a menagerie of animals, including a pet bear in the background, in his backyard for a while. I mean, he was living the crazy rich Asian life and, something of a libertine. In 89, I think there were also personal factors in the background. His wife had left him a few years earlier. Tiananmen comes along. His first wife, sorry, not Teresa. His first wife had left him, and had 3 kids. He's raising the kids. Tiananmen comes. He's so hopeful for China. I mean, Jimmy's a very, very passionate guy. Teresa's often describes him as having the soul of a Russian poet or a Russian artist. And honestly, I mean, Brothers Karamazov is one of my favorite books. And he's like he's like a Chinese cousin of, kind of a mixture of a couple of the brothers and Dmitry and Alyosha. And so, he's a very passionate guy. And I think the students, here he's been working away. And these students are like, they're willing to sacrifice everything. And they did. They sacrificed their lives. And I think he's like, wow, I have to do something. And so it was one thing to give money before the killings, and then after the killings, he felt like
Tiananmen,
June 4th, 1989. So afterwards, he's like, okay, what can I do? I'm a businessman. And he approached it as a business. He wanted to make money off this magazine. He, first and foremost looked at Next Magazine and Apple Daily as business opportunities. I think that's good. He didn't look at it as like, oh, I'm going to be a heroic pro-democracy guy. It's like, I'm a businessman. I'm living in a free city. I'm going to protect the Chinese communists are coming in 1997. I'm going to protect the city that gave me everything. And around the same time, coincidentally, just a month after the Tiananmen killings, a young woman named Teresa Lee, who spent a summer cadet at the South China Morning Post, came to interview him, and he fell in love with her. He courted her. He followed her back to Paris, and through her, he met people. Well, actually, he met Martin Lee, the great democracy activist, separately. One of Martin's aides just called up to me, was this like outspoken businessman, but Martin is Catholic, Teresa's Catholic. He met a whole part of the Catholic activist community, and he didn't want to convert. And then a week after the handover, he decided he would convert to Catholicism. And as Teresa said, he knew trouble was coming and figured it'd be good to have higher power could be good. And I mean that actually quite seriously. He didn't, for most of the next 20 years, he didn't, dinners, he wouldn't sit around and, talk about God or Catholicism or religion. I almost never heard him talk about that. He's much more interested in talking about democracy and freedom. But since he's gone to prison, his faith has been incredibly important. It's his faith and Teresa's support and love that's really kept him going. And he is not rotting in prison. Of course, he wants to be out. Wants to be out, go back to Britain. He's a UK citizen, and recover his health and spend his time with his family. But until then, he's making the most of it, a really, really difficult situation. But so I guess I'd see the freedom as you start with economic freedom and Hayek and von Mises and Friedman. And then if you're looking at this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you kind of keep moving up to a more spiritual level of freedom.
Okay, so he moves from just believing in kind of libertarian economic principles and a remarkable pathway of self-education with interaction and a little bit of guidance to being profit-oriented, but still quite public-spirited entrepreneur of new and independent media. And from there, he takes a step further to become a political activist in a way, and as you tell the story, to a remarkable degree of personal financial expenditure, a funder of the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. So can you say more about what drew him into what we saw in your photographs of personal political activism and, deep financial commitment to the Hong Kong democracy movement?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's one of these things like step by step. You get in the water and you just keep going deeper and deeper, and pretty soon you're swimming. I don't know exactly when the financial contribution started, but best estimates are he spent well over $100 million in those 20 or so
US
years.
dollars.
US dollars in those. He was the major funder. He may have been majority funder. I don't really know, for a variety of the pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong, Democratic Party and others. But he's also just an incredibly generous person to his friends and just to people he meets. And I know he's been very, very generous to the Catholic Church. He's helped a lot of people with education. So he's a guy who's just generous. And the pro-democracy movement and the Catholic Church, I think, are the two main, beneficiaries of that largesse. I think what's, to me, that's remarkable. I mean, almost no business person in China, certainly not in modern China, is going to stand up and give money out. Nobody else in Hong Kong like this, but almost very few people in the world. We've seen some examples in Russia, and they didn't end well for those people. But I think what's more remarkable is when he starts getting physically involved. And you saw in 2003 that Apple and Next had helped get 500,000 people out in the streets. Jimmy kind of retreated for the next decade. He spent a lot of that decade in Taiwan. Chen Shui-bian, of course, had been elected president in 2000, breaking the Kuomintang's 50-year monopoly on power. Jimmy set up the newspaper, the magazine first, Next Taiwan, and then set up Apple Daily Taiwan. Huge successes. He was so certain that these were going to be a springboard to the mainland. It was not just Cantonese media, it was Mandarin. The mainland was going to open up. And obviously he was a little ahead of his time, but he had real success in Taiwan, but he wanted to get into TV and animation, and he was frustrated and ultimately blocked by local Taiwan business interests. So he was really discouraged for the first time in his life and kind of really went quiet, traveled a lot. And then the 2014 umbrella movement started. It's interesting. By that point, he's into his 60s, and he wanted to step back. I think he was more than ready for the students to take the lead. And so it's ironic, but he's going out there showing solidarity. So he gets tear gassed. He sits there in front of the tents. He's eventually arrested. But that was to show solidarity. It wasn't to take a leadership role. Again, I have to keep emphasizing he's not a Mandela. He's not a Walesa. He's not a Navalny. He's not a Martin Luther King. I mean, he was a guy who kind of wanted to support from behind. He's actually a rather shy person. And then, kind of one thing leads to another, and then we're into 2019, and then he's really in the soup. So when he came here, and I think Peter Robinson said, why are you going back? And he knew for the handover, he knew there was a chance he was going to jail. And he told at least one of his associates, he said, I'd rather be hanging from a lamppost in Central, the business district of Hong Kong, hanging from a lamppost in Central, than to give the communists the satisfaction of saying, I ran away. And he's fearless. And you think of entrepreneurs, you think of people like that. He's come from nothing. He's risked his life. He's been through so much worse. Hunger, smuggling himself into Hong Kong, building, his businesses. He's like, so they throw me in jail. So what? Look what my mother went through, the labor camps and the glass and being treated as a political criminal. So, I think there's just this sense of confidence and of fearlessness and that entrepreneurial optimism. But it also means that he's somebody, the sort of person I don't think the Chinese communists, I can't think of another person that the CCP would have faced up against. He's a businessman, so he's rich and confident. He's a media person, and we know what the CCP thinks of propaganda. And he's a guy with principles, with faith, with real belief that what he's doing is something beyond him. And so, yeah, it kind of means that we've got two strong forces.
Of fearless dissidents who can't be broken, like Liu Xiaobo, but Liu didn't really, he didn't have the kind of exit options that Jimmy had at any point to live an extraordinary life abroad of comfort. Let me ask you about kind of the tactics, the tone and platform of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. There was a point when, it started surfacing more radical elements than Martin Lee. You mentioned long hair in your book, for example. One of the people who wound up getting elected to LegCo is from a more radical posture. And you started hearing kind of what Beijing heard as kind of pro-independence rhetoric. How did Jimmy feel about, that element of the movement? And was he worried that radicalization and overreach might be defeating the movement? Did he just not engage in that level of?
It's a great question, and it starts getting pretty micro. But yeah, I think Jimmy was quite concerned, or starting earlier on in 2016. So between the 2014 umbrella movement and the 2019 Summer of Democracy, there were, I guess, the most serious riots that Hong Kong had seen since 1967. The so-called fishball riots. And Jimmy called them, or Apple called them, rioters, which has a very specific legal meaning in Hong Kong. And it means you're in a lot more trouble if you go to court, if you were rioting. And I mean, that outraged the students. So a lot of the students, or I should say just a lot of the more radical in the street pro-democracy people, I mean, they really felt that Apple and Next were too cautious, were too mainstream, too middle of the road. Meanwhile, a lot of I guess more conservative people, even pro-democracy people, felt that the newspaper had gone in too radical a direction. So I mean, I think the movement itself was fairly fractured, and Apple walked a delicate balance there. I think by 2019 they had become more radical, and I think all of society had become more radicalized because, well, as students often wrote, or activists wrote, you taught us that peaceful protest doesn't work. I mean, people like Martin Lee or Jimmy, they've been working, I mean, Martin more assiduously and specifically than, consciously in politics than Jimmy. They'd been working since 1990 or before. And here we were, it was like 3 decades. Where have you gotten this? China promised all these great things. And I think we really need to remind everybody, China in the joint declaration that it signed with Britain, international treaty in 1984, promised continued freedom, continued autonomy for Hong Kong, one country, two systems approach. Beijing then promulgated a so-called basic law, which was a mini constitution in 1990. That promised free speech, right to trial by jury, right to have your own lawyer, presumption of innocence. It's everything that Hong Kong had under the British, and it promised a way forward. It promised a way to universal suffrage, which, by the way, was really just meant electing the mayor and the city council. It wasn't that big a deal. But Beijing couldn't countenance the idea that even somebody as moderate as, say, Anson Chan, who had been the #2 under Chris Patton, that she could possibly be the chief executive. Beijing could only take people that it can completely control. And I think, the example of Hong Kong shows that Beijing's promises really just can't be trusted. I mean,
Well, Alvin predicted it, so.
Yeah, 2 books, Red Flag over Hong Kong.
We'll come back to you.
I wanted to ask him about
right.
Mark Simon and the Pepsi Cola story. Do you remember that one?
I don't think I know.
Oh,
But
this was another business story. He got a delivery service where he was literally going to buy up either all the Pepsis or all the Cokes in Hong Kong and deliver them. And he lost millions, but it had an impact on the consumer price index that was notable from him manipulating the Pepsi Cola market. And anyway, that whole crashed down. But he's got all these other stories of, I mean, he's so rich with all these different business ventures, that we forget most of them unless we were to, write a long list of them down. But this was an extraordinary story. He moved the consumer price index by himself.
Incredible.
Yeah.
that was AdMart. That was an early internet shopping service.
Yes.
And he was ahead. He was too far ahead of the technology, as he often was. He lost $1 billion Hong Kong dollars, so 100.
Yeah, about 100 million on the U.S. Yeah, exactly.
And he did. Nobody, it was hard to quantify, but people kind of estimated that he brought the consumer price index down single-handedly several percentage points, a few hundred basis points. And so he had just had this impact throughout. He's just spitting ideas. Uniqlo, the fast fashion company, was founded by a guy named Tadashi Yanai. He came down to Hong Kong to learn from Jimmy Lai in the early 1980s and offered that Jimmy could have 30% of his company for $5 million. Jimmy said, no, that's worth, I don't know how many billions now. What's interesting is Yanai could scale and could build and could focus. Jimmy would have an idea, and like Giordano, brilliant idea, kind of pioneered fast fashion. By 1989, if Tiananmen hadn't come along, he was looking at setting up Chinese fast food that was going to kind of be a cross between Giordano and Chipotle, what Chipotle later did for Mexican food. Jimmy's just he's an idea man. He's an entrepreneur man. He's not a systems guy.
So I'm going to ask you one more question for now about Hong Kong. And I've got several more questions, but we'll see if they surface from the audience. Otherwise, I'll come back at the end. There is an initiative that figures prominently in this book as well, a very dark one. It's the national security law, which Beijing tries to force through once under the ministership of an individual I know well, and fails, and then comes back in 2019. And this, more than any other single thing, it seems to me, has changed Hong Kong, even to the point where I don't feel comfortable going back. So could you talk about the national security law, its provisions, and what it's done to Hong Kong?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I kind of glided over that. So that first big demonstration in 2003 was against the national security law, the first iteration of it. And it was under Article 23 of the Basic Law. Hong Kong was on its own supposed to come up with legislation that would protect national security. Okay, all sounds good, but nobody trusts the people up in Beijing for how that's going to be enforced. So you get 500,000 people out. Your friend and some other ministers resigned. Eventually, Tung Chee-hwa, the chief executive, resigned. Incredible backdown on the part of Beijing. Fast forward to 2014, then to 2019, and Beijing is trying to put the screws on more and more, and Hong Kong people aren't playing ball. Instead, they're coming out more and more. So as I said, we had 2 million people in the streets. It's unbelievable. And then at the end of that summer, and you did mention some violence, it was mostly property violence, but it was pretty intense in Hong Kong. And there were elections, and I think elections are great because they're kind of circuit breaker. You can decide, what do people really think? In Beijing, from what I hear, the newspapers had the headlines written, blue, silent majority, strikes back, votes all the pro-Beijing people in. No, incredibly high turnout, 71% turnout for this, these district council elections. It's like the lowest level ward offices, and the pro-democracy people swept. I mean, clean sweep. They got, I think, 470 something out of a little more than 500 seats. Unbelievable. I think that it's at that point, if Beijing hadn't done before, they said, we lost Hong Kong, we better get rid of Hong Kong and put our own people in there, basically. And, they could have said, oh, the people of Hong Kong have spoken. Maybe we should listen to them. Maybe we should listen to the newly elected legislators and the legislative council members. But no, they said, let's get a national security law in And this was drafted in secret. Our understanding is that the chief executive didn't even see it until early on the morning of June 30th, and it was put into place that night on June 30th. So no input, absolutely breaking the basic law, no input from Hong Kong. It's a vague, sweeping, draconian law that basically outlaws anything that the government doesn't like. It's been supplemented with the so-called Article 23 legislation, which outlaws more things that the government doesn't like. And the net reason, I mean, it's secession, subversion, collusion with foreign forces, treason. There are lots of things that, of course, countries need to protect their national security. But in this case, what it meant is we get a letter at Next Digital from John Lee, the Secretary for Security, who says he thinks that we broke the national security law. He's freezing our bank
Now the
accounts.
chief executive.
Yeah, he's now the chief executive. We're out of business. He's never proven in court. We never got a court order. We couldn't even pay our staff. And to show you the kind of Orwell meets Kafka meets, I don't know, Alice in Wonderland, the government then sued us for not paying our staff their wages, which of course we wanted to pay our staff. We had the cash. John Lee, we said each staff member's name and how much we were going to pay them. Nope, couldn't do it. So they destroyed the company. This is a publicly listed company. Jimmy was already in jail by that point. He's being charged under these national security law provisions. It was a 155-day trial. Jimmy was on the stand for over 50 days. He was first arrested, you saw in those pictures, were 5 years ago. The trial still isn't over. We're waiting for the verdict. I mean, it's going to be guilty, right? But we haven't gotten a verdict, let alone a sentence. But I'm not sure what he's really being charged with. Most of the so-called offenses took place a year before the national security law came in. And they pretty much seem to consist of, well, he met Mike Pence when he was vice president and said, can you help the people of Hong Kong as they fight for democracy? They really don't, it's a pitifully thin case, but it doesn't mean they can't find him guilty. But I was gonna say, it's not just about Jimmy, because Jimmy's story is the story of Hong Kong. So I've got 6 other colleagues from as I said, from Apple Daily who are in prison. I've got a dozen or so journalists in prison, over 700 political prisoners at this moment. More than 2,000 people have been jailed on political charges, almost all of them nonviolent, in the last 5 or 6 years since 2019. It goes on and on and on. Virtually every civil society group that has anything remotely to do with politics, or even environmental groups, have just closed up shop.
Only recently did I read Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial. And I don't know if it was subconscious in preparation for
I should reread that. I haven't read it for a long time.
But it doesn't matter. The point is, if they're going to convict you,
Right.
it doesn't matter what the charge is. Anything will do. Okay, well, let's open it up to our distinguished audience here. Would anyone like to ask a question? And if you'd like, you can introduce yourself, Rowena. And just speak up in the back.
Hi, Rowena.
Finally here.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, it's very difficult to be listening to you. And I'm sure Frank would say the same. Many of our friends out of prison. Very emotional. Here's what I'm gonna say. The last time I went to the Sai Gao Long court was for Jimmy's trial. And I still remember that day, and a few months later, I could never return to Hong Kong. The day Apple Daily was closed, my students at 2 a.m. barged into my office. They said, Rowena, we cannot sleep. We spent the night together in the history department's lounge. And here we are. Hoover. I don't want to hijack the time. Maybe one question about faith. I talked to Martin and asked Martin, how is Jimmy doing? And he said his faith kept him going. So I just wonder how the faith is connected to how he later decided to be a martyr, quote unquote. And the reason I asked, because I've been studying Lin Zhao downstairs. Right? She was executed by the CCP. And she wrote with blood in prison, in solidarity confinement every day. about Jimmy when, and of course, Martin kept telling me about the faith is important now for Jimmy to be in jail. So I just wonder how that actually affected him.
Well, I was lucky enough to get some letters that Jimmy wrote, quite a few letters in the first year or two. And it's clear, first of all, he's not rotting in prison. He's as free as he's ever been, maybe freer. Spiritually. But and it's his faith. He's reading all his reading now. It's not Hayek or Friedman or von Mises. It's all Catholic theology. And his godfather, Bill McGurn, describes his life as being like a Benedictine monk, not some wild-eyed prophet out in the cave or in the desert, but very structured. Of course, he doesn't choose when his lights go on. He doesn't choose when he eats, let alone what he eats. But he has enough time in the day that he can write letters to his family and others. I guess I'm not in touch with him anymore. I mean, this collusion with foreigners it's a crazy situation. I don't want to cause more trouble for him, but he draws a lot. You know, I was amazed when I was working on this biography, although I've known him since '93. I had no idea how serious he was as an artist. And he also has an amazing eye for color. So he's living this life of this monk. He's praying, he's studying, he's working. He's forced to do prison labor. He has to make 600 envelopes a week, I guess, at about 1 cent an envelope. He lives this very spiritual in his head life. I mean, what worries me, okay, a year or two, you're spiritually free, but we've all aged in the last 5 years, right? And here's a guy in his late 70s who's in this tiny cell, no natural light, solitary confinement for most of these 1,800 or so days. I think it'll be 1,800 days next month. And, he gets 50 minutes of light and, exercise a day. But by all accounts, mentally and spiritually, he's fine. It's just physically, I think that his family is just increasingly concerned about. But don't think he's rotting in prison. He's not. He's free, but he's only free spiritually. And he wants to get out. He really does. And he wants to leave Hong Kong.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I routinely do a Google search on Jimmy Lai trial, so I followed it very, very closely. And what's going to happen to him? I've come to believe, I think they hope he dies in jail. And the reason for that is they don't have to deal with the political fallout of actually announcing that he's guilty and where they're going to send him and what they're going to do, because clearly his health isn't getting better while he's in jail. And he's had some down periods, at least his children have been talking a little bit about that. Larry, you hosted an event across the way with Nathan Law and his friend whose name I don't remember. But the Chinese Hong Kong government has said, if we think you've broken the law in Hong Kong, we can get you anywhere in the world, which is an extraordinary statement. And there's almost bounties on people. So we have no idea how many are on that watch list, but we know some people very famous are on that watch list. So it's quite clear that they can separate economic well-being from no political freedom. In fact, the Fraser Institute, which only recently started having a human freedom rights along with its economic rights, economics #1, freedom is now down to like 87. So you can see they've managed to hold on to old Hong Kong, although, you never know what's going to come. And the political system has just deteriorated. It started deteriorating very early, though. I mean, I remember meeting Martin Lee way back when, and these guys were working hard. But I think Jimmy fell into a situation that was made for him in some ways. This democracy movement had been going strong, and I had a lot of nasty letters. I wouldn't dare. Just one last story, and then I'll give the floor back. With some colleagues, we wrote this book, Red Flag in Hong Kong, published in 1995. And it was a bestseller in English language Hong Kong. What does that mean? 800 copies. It makes you a bestseller in English language. On July 2nd, 1997, it disappeared from the shelves of all the bookstores. That's it. And I certainly would never go back to Hong Kong myself. So it was clear. In fact, in 1998, I wrote a little pamphlet for Hoover called Freedom's Fall in Hong Kong. And I was signaling that. So this is, going and going and going. And I think he got caught up with it and just was what he was, and it's a sad, sad story.
Well, the story's not over yet. Before you reply, I just want to make one point. Any ratings agency of economic freedom that could look at what happened to Apple Daily and still say, Hong Kong is #1 in economic freedom, has a deeply, deeply flawed methodology. Over to you.
Agree with you completely. Let me take this issue of dying in jail because it becomes more pertinent with every day. I do not think that the Chinese want him to die in jail. Then he is a martyr. They cannot control the narrative anymore. I think it's very interesting. President Trump just came back from his meeting with Xi Jinping. We understand he brought up Jimmy Lai. The Chinese took it on board. They didn't push back. I mean, they understand that this is a serious problem and they need a way out. I hope that they understand it would be good for Sino U.S. relations. It would be good for, I think it would be good for China itself. It'd certainly be good for Hong Kong. It takes an irritant out of the way. If he dies in prison, that fact can never be changed. And so I do think.
Well, I hope you're right.
I hope that I think there is an off ramp, and I think President Trump has made that really really clear to the Chinese. I think other people have as well, but he's perhaps the most important.
And he can elevate that, President Trump, in the run-up to their summit next, April or something?
Yeah, we don't know exactly when the summit is, but we think sometime in the April or thereabouts.
Okay.
So, but in terms of the transnational repression and the bounties, well, we do know there are bounties on at least 35 people, including 2 of my colleagues. It's outrageous that people like Chloe Chung, Francis Hoy, my colleagues, have bounties on their head for work that they've done in the U.S. and the U.K. free speech, protected work, and the fact that more governments haven't pushed back to that is I think really disheartening. I don't know that I agree with. I want to underscore what Larry said, which is you can't really separate economic well-being from political control. It's maybe in the early days. I was in South Korea and there was, the economy will grow and politics will be repressed. That kind of runs out of road. And I think particularly in a place like Hong Kong, how can you have a global financial center that has political prisoners just because they ran a newspaper, that shuts down a publicly traded company? We were number 0282 on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and we were just shut down. Tell me that there's rule of law when you're shut down without a court order just because the Secretary for Security doesn't like you.
But just one short comment. Look at the demographic structure. 1997 to today, 27 years? Okay, now take a look at people who were 27 and under know zip about. Now let's go up to 10 years of old. They don't know anything. People 37 under don't know anything about the colonial period, about civil rights, about free speech. That would probably take it up to 43, okay? So given the youth of the population, a huge, huge share of Hong Kong people have no personal memory of the kind of civil liberties that they used to have.
And yet the students, the ones who were born around 97 were the ones who led the
No, that's true. That's true.
Hey, Augustine, go ahead and then we'll come to you. Go ahead.
So this is something that I've kind of always wondered about when it comes to Hong Kong. So I was there in 2019 and I was at CUHK, and so I saw these things and I have some familiarity. But one of the things which I have always been a little bit unsure of, right, is the extent to which China actually clamped down on Hong Kong because of the threat that the changing political dynamics pose to the core ideology of the party, versus whether essentially political liberalization in Hong Kong actually posed a real and serious threat to Hong Kong's capacity to act as this gray zone for Chinese capital, right? Like I think for a variety of reasons. Hong Kong has this like really integral role in Asia, where it handles a lot of like kind of like dirtier backroom dealings, like with the Chinese Indonesian capital, which is like more okay, North Korean capital, but basically, and also things like how the numbers in the property market are inflated. So do you think, basically, was the threat primarily ideological, or was it just that they expected that basically, if the yellow camp took the government, they'd clean up shop, and that would clamp down on the gray money capacity for Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't have liked that to happen, but it's never happened. And I think it was much more ideological. And I mean, the real question is, was Hong Kong really a threat or not? I mean, Frank and I were just talking about this a little while ago, but I mean, and by the way, we've done a lot of research at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Just came out the report last week on Canadian technology that's being used to funneled through Hong Kong to fuel the Russian war machine. We did one last year on the U.S. We have more work on this coming out. I mean, Hong Kong is the most important node in the world for getting smuggling technology that's being used to kill Ukrainians. And it's going into Iran as well, into the drones. You mentioned North Korea, there's also Burma. So, but I don't think that that was such a distant worry, I think, that I don't think that was a major issue, but maybe I'm naive.
I think, if I recall correctly, there was more than one point at which Jimmy understood or believed that what happened in Hong Kong could affect what happens in mainland China. And wasn't that part of his motivation?
Well, yes, and I think Taiwan was more important for him because it's the day Chen Shui-bian was elected, March 2020, March 2000. He said to Teresa over dinner, "We're moving to Taiwan."
Wow.
She said yes, and they did. He really thought that Taiwan, with had much closer links, with China was going to be the springboard. But now he always hoped that Hong Kong or Taiwan would, ignite something in the mainland.
We have a question there, but did you have something exactly on this? So let's come to you, and then we'll come to Frances has either her own question or an online question. Go ahead.
The fact that Jimmy Lai is the British citizen, is Mr. Starmer working on this?
Yeah, yes and yes. I mean, it is important that he's a British citizen. He got his citizenship, I think, in 1992. I mentioned his birth date before. I've seen a couple of different passports. They have different birth dates on them. So nobody really knows when he was born. But yeah, Starmer and the UK government have been working on it. I think and I think it's important that the US and the UK work together. I'd like to see Britain be more forceful than they have been. But as you know, if you follow British politics, they seem to be very compromised and conflicted about their relations with China.
Related to current spy issues in British politics, should the U.S. worry about our ally situation, relationship to China?
Yeah. Let me just say that we have another interesting spy case that's coming up, which is out of London, which is the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, which seems to have been used as an espionage center for activities to harass dissidents and other people, even in commercial disputes. So I don't know if we have to worry about Britain in terms of, as allies. I think British people should worry that their government is, I hesitate, I'll say spineless when it comes to dealing with Beijing. We've got this huge new embassy that's clearly going to be used for repressive purposes that the British government, the Starmer government, seems determined to push through. We seem to have this kind of desperate need on the part of Britain to keep good relations with China, despite the seemingly, supposedly because of economic interest, but the trade and the foreign direct investment numbers are tiny, actually. So I don't quite understand why Britain lost its nerve and its spine in standing up for its values in dealing with China.
It is a growing international phenomenon. China, Russia, Iran, some other countries, certainly Rwanda, have engaged in it. It's called transnational repression. And unfortunately, it's accelerating. And if you don't stand up to it, it super accelerates. Okay, go ahead, Francis.
Question from the online audience that we have. Wanted to ask, understand that, advocating for Jimmy Lai and other political prisoners in Hong Kong is a major component of what the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong does. And that right now there may be an opportune window when it comes to how the current administration in bringing up Jimmy Lai's case. When you think of the broader portfolio of actions that the committee is engaged on and policy priorities that you have, is there anything else that you're particularly optimistic about under this current administration when it comes to policy changes that might make a difference for the people of Hong Kong?
That's a really nice, interesting question. We have a legislative agenda. We're engaged. We have offices in Washington, D.C. and in London. We're particularly engaged in a legislative sense in the U.S. And there are a number of I guess we're a hammer. I mean, we're not involved with negotiations. We're not involved with the Lai family. We're not the Jimmy Lai Freedom Foundation. We're trying to put, our strategy is to put pressure and cause pain for the Hong Kong and Chinese government. So we have legislation which came very close to passing last time that would shut down the Hong Kong economic and trade offices. There's one in San Francisco, there's one in Washington, D.C., and there's one in New York. And at a time when, as Larry said, transnational repression is increasing, why would you want to basically give China 3 extra embassies or consulates? So we have legislative work there. We're working on sanctioning officials, especially for the first time, judges and prosecutors. We're trying to look at having Hong Kong designated as a primary money laundering concern, which would look more closely at these financial transactions. It's outrageous that Hong Kong is trading on its bona fides that were developed during 156 years of British colonial rule to become like the transit point for material that kills Ukrainians. I mean, it's just, it's beyond belief. So, we have these legislative, I guess, pain points. We'd like to, this is symbolic, but we'd like to name the street in front of, and we've gotten legislation, all this legislation has been introduced in the final bill that we've engaged with, is to name the street in front of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in Washington, D.C., Jimmy Lai Way. So that's not really going to cause a lot of pain, except maybe psychic, but those are things that we're working on. And I was going to say, we have more research coming. So we've just come out with something on Hong Kong prison conditions as well. So please look it up.
Any questions from around the perimeter before I go back to Rowena? Okay, go ahead.
Along with Mark's comments about Liu Xiaobo and mentioned that the CCP don't want Jimmy Lai to be a martyr, I agree with you. Actually, at that time, they gave Liu Xiaobo a lot of opportunity to leave, and he refused to until the final moments that he wanted to trade that to save Liu Xia and Liu Tao, I mean Liu Xia's brother. So I think they do not want martyrs die in prison. That's my reaction as well. And very quickly, I think we mentioned modern China history. Someone like Jimmy, probably the only person that I can think of would be Charlie Song, the father-in-law of Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, the father of Song Mei-ning and Song Qing-mi. So he was businessman. He was famous. He's in publishing. He gave tons of money to Sun Yat-sen, but he doesn't have Jimmy's that kind of sentiments that he wanted to die and things like that. And the third, it would be a question. I've been wondering what we can do internationally to help the case, because I remember 2003, I was collecting signatures with people against Article 23, and it worked. But yesterday, I mean last week, I still signed a petition, but I wasn't sure if it was helping, or actually the CCP would frame this as anti-China foreign forces to give us pressure. So,
I mean, they will try to frame anything they don't like as anti-China, right? I mean, one of their great slates of hand is to conflate anti-China and anti-CCP. I mean, I think probably everybody in this room who has any experience with China, loves Chinese people, right? It has nothing to do with the CCP, but they've somehow, convinced the world that if you don't do what they like, that you're anti-China. So I think we just have to accept that. I wish, there were more people like you and many people in this room who were brave enough to speak up. The march of, as Larry knows very well, I mean, that list of countries, the march of authoritarianism is going the wrong way at this point. And all we can do is just keep fighting. Everybody's going to fight in their own way, I guess.
Don't misunderstand me. I fully understand how the CCP's logic. My question was sometimes when I work with dissidents, sometimes we speak out too much, and then the CCP would feel that you are doing this and that, and then it would be worse for the case. And that's why sometimes the family members did not want us to be outspoken.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
I'm wondering.
That's a little bit different. You're talking about specific political prisoners. I mean, we've run across people who they think if they're quiet, they're more likely to get out sooner. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're not. Mostly when, everybody, I've been doing this as long as some people like Perry Link is on our board. Obviously there are other people who have been doing this for decades. Most of the time when you speak out for political prisoners, it helps them in the long run. Sometimes things are worse in the short run, but mostly publicity helps. If you're forgotten by the world, what hope do you have really? So I think we have to keep speaking out, keep shining a spotlight. Sometimes it's just a moral spotlight or just it's the right thing, but it's also the right thing for China, I think, just speaking about Hong Kong, to ease off on Hong Kong. China's made its point. I mean, the opposition is destroyed. Apple daily presses are not going to be rolling again. Why not ease up and show the world that, you don't just have humanity, but you also understand that you really do need rule of law if you want to be part of the modern financial system.
I think the answer to your question is embedded in the title of your previous book, Today, Hong Kong, Tomorrow, the World, what China's crackdown reveals about its plans to end freedom everywhere. Is there any bridge between your last book and this one that you want to reflect on?
Well, it's interesting that I think with the subtitle of that one, my editor at St. Martin's came up with that, and it was kind of, I think it's kind of an SEO. Everybody wants these subtitles now. I thought it was a little bit over the top. The book came out at the beginning of February 2022, and I got a few questions. Really, they want to end freedom everywhere, and then the Russians invaded Ukraine, and people realized, yeah, actually, between Putin and Xi Jinping and a few others, yeah, people do want to end freedom everywhere, I think. But more to the point, if you can take a modern city like Hong Kong and in the space of less than 5 years, completely crush civil society, media, the churches are increasingly, being forced to have Chinese flags, the cynicization of religion, NGOs, civil society, all sorts of organizations. If you can crush a free city like Hong Kong, what the plan is going to be for Taiwan. And then you just kind of go up and down the East Asian coast. You look at the Philippines, you look at Korea, you look at Vietnam, and I don't know, then you look at where you go from there. But I mean, clearly that's China's strategy. But when that earlier book came out, I don't think I was as concerned as I am now. We hadn't had all these bounties hadn't come out. I mean, again, you think of it, it's $128,000 to bring somebody back. And was a Canadian politician, Canadian Chinese, who said that his opponent, Joe Tay, who was a radio host, I believe, in Hong Kong, who had a bounty on his head, he said, yeah, take Joe down to the consulate and collect your bounty. I mean, it's an invitation for kidnapping. It's an invitation for serious transnational repression. So anybody who thinks that China's ambitions end at its borders is deluding themselves.
Well, it keeps this realm of experience, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, continually reminds me of that speech Abraham Lincoln gave, I think at the Lyceum, well before he became president. This nation cannot long remain half free and half slave. It will become all one thing or all the other. And I think I've had the impression for a long time that the Chinese leadership, particularly in the wake of Gorbachev, and even more especially under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has taken that to heart and therefore has concluded it must be all slave or the virus of the danger of it becoming all free will be unleashed.
I think you're right. So I guess we have to keep bearing witness and, carrying the light. I'm reminded, I spent 5 years in Korea, and Willy Brandt, the father of Ostpolitik, was there in October 1989. Here's a guy who knew more about Germany or those relations than just about anybody. He said, the wall will never come down in my lifetime. A month later, it was down.
Yeah.
So, we obviously play for time. I would say that the CCP has already it's past its sell-by date. It's done a remarkable job in some ways in terms of unifying and, bringing up standards of living, education, health, and, for, hundreds and hundreds of millions of Chinese. We've never seen economic growth and development of the sort that, we saw in China these last couple decades, but enough is enough, right? And, it's already lasted longer than the Soviet Union did. So, I think totalitarian governments just have a shorter shelf life.
So in that spirit, and we'll kind of begin to wrap up here. You spent 33 years in Asia. Obviously, all of that time you were having some kind of window on China. We spent the last 70 minutes talking about Hong Kong, but really, I think a lot of your work and a lot of your writing certainly brings us back to the reality that you can't talk about the future of Hong Kong without talking more broadly about the People's Republic of China. So what would you hope for in terms of U.S.-China policy more generally in the next few years?
Well, I mean, what I hope for with China is that they realize, first of all, I should say, I spent my first 5 years in Asia, in Korea. I happened to get there a week before the June 1987 demonstrations broke out.
Wow.
So within a month of arriving in Asia, we've seen Korea go from a military authoritarian government to, being on the road to democracy. So, and then Taiwan lifted martial law after 4 decades or so, a month later. So it can be easy, but it takes enlightened leadership. And I would hope that there are lots of people in China who'd like to see a loosening. But absent that loosening, if China is going to treat the U.S. like an enemy and prepare for war with the U.S., which by all signs, this is what the mantra is, then I think the U.S. needs to take I don't think we want to cut China off tomorrow, but I would hope that this administration, the first Trump administration, I think really moved the dial in terms of how Americans think about China. I would hope that the second one would have an approach, particularly in terms of denying China technology that they wouldn't have otherwise. And we want to slow down the pace of Chinese development and their ability to threaten not just us, but their neighbors and really everyone in the world.
And that brings us back to NVIDIA chips, and that brings us back to Taiwan and the point we keep making in our Taiwan program, vigilant, robust, very imaginative and energetic deterrence to ensure that Hong Kong's fate is not Taiwan's fate. Is there anything else before we close? Yes?
So I'm actually an international student from Hong Kong, and I was 14 years old when I was with 2 million people on the street. So I know that I'm very fortunate that I'm in this place and I was able to have this conversation and everything. So I'm curious, so I still have friends and family in Hong Kong, and what I noticed is that they're not trying actively to forget what has happened, but more like it hurts them to remember. So I was wondering, in this case, what would you recommend them to think about it, or how should I approach this topic? Because I still actively think about this and I want to discuss with people, but I don't think they want to bring it up.
Well, I think first of all, it's understandable. I mean, we've had 150,000 or more Hong Kongers move to the UK in the last 5-6 years, and under the BNO visa program, and many of them just want to kind of integrate and just get on and become citizens in a new country. And I mean, I think that's perfectly understandable. I hope that enough people remember Hong Kong and remember it as it was, but don't just look back nostalgically, but also just kind of carry this concept of freedom and realize that in the DNA of Hong Kong people, I think in all people, but I mean particularly strong in Hong Kong, there's this desire for freedom, and that we can't forget what a remarkable place this was, despite or because of, I don't know, still British colonialism, and you know, Chinese energy, not sure what to say, but nothing like this developed in the Chinese mainland. And want to celebrate it without being nostalgic, but still keep it alive. I don't know, it's a great question.
Anything else? Yes, sir?
Hey, just a quick one. Those of us that heard Jimmy Lai's comments in, I guess it was 2019 here, most of us will never forget them. It was quite moving and just amazing. My question is a little different. The thrust and the growth of capitalism in Hong Kong as a result of the unique structure they had. I learned some lessons from a relative who happened to be in Deepwater Bay for a number of years, running a big investment bank. And they were equally as awesome about how the uniqueness provided economic and competitive advantages and all this sort of thing. Is there an opportunity, and perhaps Hoover's ahead of me here, but is there an opportunity for the archives, the Hoover archives, maybe at this point, to start developing some of the knowledge, the historical knowledge of Hong Kong's growth on the capitalism side, and what an engine that is for freedom and for economic development?
Turn to either Larry or Alvin.
Anyone from the
Francis to
Hoover
answer that.
Archive?
I mean, I would think yes.
Eric, wake in here.
Hi, I am Amanda Robb. I'm the Chinese language materials archivist at Hoover. I work with Xiaoting, who's our curator, who collects the materials. I don't know if he's collecting anything specifically about economics, but I do know that he's gathering a lot about, he's growing the Hong Kong subject collection, and we have materials on the umbrella movement. And I know that he's been working on Taiwan materials and other materials that are sort of related to this. So I don't know, but I will take that feedback to him and hopefully he can build that out. I just process the collections, but if you'd like to email me, I'd be happy to pass
Sure.
it along.
And Eric wake in as well, perhaps.
Oh, I think that would probably, if you could email him, that's probably above my pay grade. So you can just email him.
Might be a good team.
It would be. And also, you might know then next March, we're having a new exhibit called Escape to Freedom. That'll be in the hall, and I've been working with Xiaoting, and so every curator gets 1 to 2 cases, so it's a collaborative effort, and we're actually working, our focus is on the Tan Diallo papers who just came. So he's a researcher, sorry, I get excited and I talk a lot, but it is relevant. So it's actually, I was really excited to hear, well, excited, I'm sorry, that's maybe an insensitive word. I was very interested to hear that that he also started out fleeing to Hong Kong because we're looking at basically the stories of 3 refugees who fled from the sent down youth camps into Hong Kong, one of which actually stowed away in a boat from Macau into Hong Kong. Anyway, the 3 of them then ended up in the U.S. at various different points. One in the 90s because she was concerned about the 97 handover. And anyway, a lot of very relevant themes that'll be coming out hopefully in our little case and a half. But so each curator, Eric Wakin has his own case. I don't know what's going to be in it yet. But so everybody look out for that. It should be very interesting and very relevant to all of this.
Okay.
Just one last comment. There's approximately 22 years to go till the lease expires. And if you remember 1982, Mrs. Thatcher went to Beijing and Deng Xiaoping said investors should put their hearts at ease. And then they started the process of drafting the basic law. And believe it or not, I ended up in helping the Basic Law Drafting Committee of Hong Kong on Chapter 5, which was the economy. And I actually wrote a long paper they translate into Chinese. So I thought they did a pretty good job on that back in the early 90s. So looking at returns on investment, we're getting very close to where people are going to say, should I start moving my money out, or are they going to extend the lease? If they don't extend it, what are we going to have? Well, we're going to have China. If we do extend it, what are we going to keep? What are we not going to keep? And I suspect that maybe even earlier, maybe 16, 17, 18 years, we're going to see some movement. And I think that's going to be the signal as to what they intend for the economic situation in Hong Kong. And then I think we'll see whether or not the politics of the situation also matters and whether Trump can pry Jimmy Lai loose. But it's not that far away. I mean, too bad I won't be around to see it, but I think it'll be a very interesting period when that starts to happen.
Yeah, no, just quickly, Alvin's absolutely right. It's not a lease, of course, but it's the agreement, which runs out in 2047. So if the history of the 80s is any indication, banks making mortgages and other people,
Yeah,
people
exactly.
want the legal certainty. So I'm surprised it hasn't come up. I think it would have come up if we had a free press. I mean, 22 years is not that long. Lots of mortgages are 25 years.
But
So
maybe money's coming in so fast you can't see the money going out. So
yeah, could be. We'll see. It'll be interesting.
So if I may, I'd like to close, Mark, by reading the epigraph to your book from Congressman John Lewis, which I presume is what helped to inspire the title of your book.
Well, it's funny. It was actually Jimmy. I said one time I was interviewing him, and I said, "Why do you do this?" He goes, this was June of 2019 or so. He goes, "I don't know. I'm a troublemaker." And then, of course, well, read the epigraph. I don't think he had met John Lewis, but I don't think that's why.
Why don't you read it? It's your book.
Okay, well, thanks for remembering it. No, but so John Lewis, many of you know, was one of the great civil rights leaders in America that went on to become a congressman. And I found out only in the course of writing this book, met Jimmy Lai. They were walking through the halls of Congress. I don't actually write it in there, but it was actually Tom Swazi, who's a congressman now, great human rights guy, who was with Jimmy and Martin and a few other people, and they ran across John Lewis. And there's a picture in the book of John Lewis talking with Jimmy and with Martin. So I'm not sure that Jimmy knew this quote, but it's a great quote because every time I mention it, people are like, "Oh, it's from John Lewis." So John Lewis said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble."
Okay, well, I highly recommend this book. It's a great read. It's a quick read because it's a gripping story. And Mark, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.